Thank you for joining us on the Real Biblical Application Podcast. Today we have Bradley Ballard with us, who's come on to discuss the parable of the sower, one that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, but always good to refresh and get different perspectives from it and think about it in new ways. And so we're going to discuss the parable today. And Bradley, I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
Bradley, tell us a little bit about yourself. You've done some work overseas, quite a bit of work overseas, and now you're in Tyler, right?
Longview, actually. We're in East Texas, and I'd say I didn't know you were going to ask about me. I was, after graduating college, I worked as a middle school orchestra director for 8 years, and I thought that was going to be what I did for the long haul. But then one of the congregation that we helped to establish, actually in our home in Denton County, over in the Dallas area, the brother that we kind of dedicated to go over to do some foreign work in Cambodia, he invited Brandy and I to go with him. And so Brandy and I moved in 2014, the summer of 2014, with Jonathan and Marissa Edwards to Cambodia. Lived and worked there for 2 years, came back for a little over a year, during which time we were asked to move to South Korea. And, sorry, I said that weird, South Korea. And we lived there for 3 years. And the work we tried to get going there got cut a little short by COVID. We had anticipated being there another couple of years, but when we returned home to the States, we moved out to Longview to try to follow up on some leads from the Let the Bible Speak program that Brother Brett Hickey does. And so we've been out here working with a small startup congregation and loving Longview. So that's where we are now.
What was it like, and be as descriptive or vague as you would like, what was it like, and what were some of the challenges of being in Korea during COVID? I was overseas as well during COVID. I was in Australia, and there were some pretty hefty lockdowns and things like that presented some challenges for us. What was it like in Korea?
We really saw mostly just the front end of it, because the brethren in Oklahoma that were coordinating our work over there really wanted to get us back. They felt like they could keep us safer if we were back. And I say only the front end. I guess it happened. I guess we left in October 2020, so we got to see a good bit of it because it hit Korea before it got over here. But Korea is already, they're not obviously communists or anything like that, but they are more communally minded. And so the concept of the government having your cell phone number is not something that concerns them. They're fine with it because these coordinated, phone message blasts will go out to an area and let them know if someone in the area has tested positive, and where it happened and what areas to avoid. And their public transportation and things, people already were wearing masks daily. If they were feeling under the weather, they would wear a mask for the sake of the other people on the bus, and things like that. So the concept of a mask mandate was less of a stretch. They didn't take it as personal freedoms being attacked or anything. It was actually during COVID that Ryan and Tiffany Spradley moved over there to help us. And so we all were quarantined in our apartment. And there, when it was really, at the beginning of it, I would bundle up, have my, masks and hat, looked like I was in a, hazmat suit sort of. I would go to the grocery store and I would haul things back. And then Brandy would help me stand at the entryway door to our apartment that we were all four sharing. We would use disinfectant wipes to wipe everything down before passing it into the apartment. And then Tiffany would go hide and I would strip down and go take a disinfectant shower, and, felt like I was in an airlock or something. So that was the beginning, when we didn't know what this thing was and all of that. So,
right.
Ryan being diabetic and Tiffany being pregnant at the time, their concerns were heightened, and we were trying to be sensitive to that. So it was when they finally did start allowing us to get out, I say they being the Korean government, when they started letting people start to get out a little bit, it was very small. I mean, it was very slow. People still wanted to stay in, but they were using food deliveries for everything and delivery for everything there. So the delivery companies, I think, probably had a boom, but they were already using that system anyway. And the last thing I'll say about that is we were just starting in our work to take people who had nothing in common with each other except for us. We were reaching out to people in different places and different groups and studying with them in different ways. And we're just starting to kind of bring them together into a group where they could start to ask each other, the same types of questions that they were asking us, and sort of try to establish what I call kind of a fledgling fellowship. Even though they weren't converted, give them the chance to talk with other Koreans and other people that knew how they had been brought up about the message that we were bringing, and sort of compare notes and see, how that would give them a chance to kind of learn and grow together. And right as we were starting to get to that point was when the lockdowns really hit. And so it was discouraging, because I felt like we had worked to build up some good momentum, and then, that happened. So I still have hope for the folks over there. I have one weekly study with a fellow who's continued on, and we have just some fantastic, Bible studies together. And my hope is that through him and others, we can, reconnect. And once things are, once the timing is right, if we can lay the right groundwork, we can get over there maybe for a few weeks and kind of rekindle stuff. So that's maybe a little more than you were asking for. That's what's going on there.
Yeah. I remember whenever I was in Korea with you, and a lot of people didn't seem to have cars. They might have transportation like scooters, but it seemed like a large, maybe majority or maybe half, I don't know the percentage, would either use public transport because the public transport is so great over there, or they would use like scooters or something like that. But I don't ever remember seeing a large amount of traffic on the road. It was mostly foot traffic of people walking places, especially in like Seoul, where people seemed like largely took like subways and everything. And I can imagine in the beginning with COVID, the large concern of getting on public transportation with a large group of people, and they kind of just pack in there like sardines too. So I can imagine the concern from the Koreans during that time.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the first occasions. I think they call it a super spreader or whatever they call it when a big outbreak happens. Was a situation that a populated area, one person. In fact, I think there was some kind of religious event that they were attending, and it put them around a big group of people, and they had a big outbreak. But we were traveling in Seoul one time in the winter, and we were there during the trend for the really, really puffy coats. And the Seoul subway in the winter at rush hour, when everyone's in puffy coats, you don't even have to hold on to anything. You're crammed in there so tight, and everyone's got a big pillow around them. So you're just kind of. So it was, you're snug. You're really snug. And
long coats too. Like they'll go down to the ankles with like this big puffy coat. I remember that.
Oh man, I got one. They're fantastic. We just need colder weather. It's like a sleeping bag with a hood. It's awesome.
All right. Well, one of the last things you said earlier is that you were laying groundwork there in Korea. And I think groundwork is actually what we're talking about today with the parable of the sower. So we'll get back on track with that segue. And I think a good place to start with the parable of the sower is just to read through the parable.
Yes, sir.
It's in Matthew 13, but it's also found, I think, in Mark 4 and Luke 8 as well. Mm-hmm. Specifically, we'll probably focus on Matthew 13 today. But if you wouldn't mind just starting us off by reading the parable, so we're all refreshed in what Jesus taught there, and then we can kind of have a discussion around it.
Yes, sir. All right. Well, I'll read, like you said, Matthew chapter 13. I'll read verses 1 through 9, and then I think I'll jump then to where he explains the parable in verse 18 through 23, and we'll refer to the middle section later. But okay. I'm reading from the New King James Version. You had asked earlier, so this is from the New King James. It says, Matthew 13, verse 1, on the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea, and great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. Then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places, where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up, because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground, and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Then, is it all right if we move ahead to verse 18?
Sure.
Jesus, going on and explaining the parable, says in verse 18, therefore, hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who received seed by the wayside. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. But he who receives seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30.
So here we have an interesting parable, but before we get to the parable, something else is interesting. Jesus, he was sitting by the sea, and there was a crowd that approached him, and then he got in a boat and began talking to him. Why would he get in a boat to address these people?
Oh, well, I'm not a whiz at how acoustics work, but I think perhaps it allowed him to be heard a little better. Certainly it allowed him to get back away from the crowd. I can't remember which passage refers to him having to get out in the boat so that he would not be crushed by the crowd. There was such an energy and I don't want to use the phrase mob mentality, but, those who were at the back certainly wanted to. If you've ever been at the front of a line and you're trying to stop, but the crowd behind you is moving you forward, it's kind of like the concept of a train trying to stop. You hit the brakes in the front and the whole train has to, back up it, that momentum is still there. So Jesus, I think, as a matter of safety and practicality, was getting himself out away from the crowd so that more could see him, more people could see him, he could be heard. That seems to be what's going on here at the beginning.
Yeah, I've seen and been at concerts. I usually, if I'm at a concert, I don't like to be at the front because the people at the front often get crushed by the people behind them as they push up and try to get closer. I'm not really the type of person that goes to concerts like that anymore because I would rather go to a concert where I have my own seat and I can sit down and not have to stand the whole time. I guess that just comes with being older, but yeah, I could definitely see that happening. And I also see the acoustical benefit. If you are talking into a crowd, like if the crowd is just right there in front of you and your voice is just going into their bodies, then it's not going to carry throughout the crowd.
Yeah.
But if you give yourself a little bit of separation and use the acoustics of the water as well, it allows that sound to kind of go further, and people further back would be able to hear you. I've always, wondered how, Jesus would preach to a crowd of 5,000 people, especially in an outdoor environment.
Mm-hmm.
Me and you have been to meetings where there's like maybe 1,000 people there in a big room, in a room that's made for acoustics and made to amplify sound. And if you were to take the mic away from the person speaking, the people at the very back, they'd still be able to hear, but it would be pretty muffled, even up on a stage and in an acoustical room. Outside, 5 times that. I'm always, curious how his voice was able to be heard with such a large crowd in an environment where sound, would escape. That in itself may have been a miracle.
Yeah, who knows?
In this parable that Jesus spoke, he talks about these different types of soil, and a man who's casting seed, and it falls on these different types of soil, or different types of ground. He's obviously not, he doesn't care where it falls. He just wants to get as much out as possible. It seems he's not really showing any partiality between different types of soil, or maybe he can't even distinguish it very well. But anyways, he's throwing this seed on the soil, and Jesus tells us essentially how that seed does in that patch of soil. And then he goes on to explain the significance of each soil and what it represents. So let's go through the parable and kind of go through the different types of soil and kind of talk about what they represent and what Jesus is trying to teach from this parable.
So one of the things that I realized early on in looking at this parable more closely is that even though Jesus uses some other metaphors and things prior to this, this is actually the first parable that we read about him using. He's used images in the past of trees and things like that, but this is the first time that he is taught in this manner, which he would go on. It would become a critical part of how he taught in the future. And not only is it his first parable, but this is one of the few times that all three of, at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they parallel their accounts, their parallel accounts mirror each other very, very closely. And by that, I mean, not only do each of them recount the Lord's sharing of the parable, his initial telling of what he told the people, but it also recounts his later explanation. And then in between there, the explanation he gives about the purpose of parables. And so we have this very clear giving of the parable, reason why parables are important, and then explanation of that parable. He does that same thing, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that same structure. The details are very, very, consistent and clear there. And so it strikes me that, this is an exciting parable because we get to see Jesus teaching for this, in this way for the first time. One of the reasons I really started trying to understand this parable and some of the principles that it, teaches, actually stemmed from our time living and working abroad, in Cambodia and in South Korea. And the same thing is true here. But for us in those foreign works, working in that way, it's a very tiresome work. You're having to kind of examine what you know about the gospel and how to teach it to others, and your approach, your goals. We had to basically just strip our thinking down kind of to the bare essentials, the bare level, and had to, for example, in teaching about farming and things, whenever the Lord talks about harvest of wheat. We started actually using harvests of rice. We spoke in terms of rice sometimes because they weren't wheat farmers, but they were rice farmers. Not everyone had land to farm on, but they knew what it meant. They were familiar with the doubled over, the older people who were doubled over from their life of planting and, harvesting rice, a grain at a time. And they were familiar with that. And so to talk about a wheat field made it kind of, But when you spoke in terms of a rice harvest, And so that's just one example, but we had to speak very simply because we were not going to a place where people understood really where we were coming from. And basic biblical principles had to be laid out. And sometimes even before we could do that, we had to challenge them to give up some of their Buddhist thinking and other ways of thinking. So it challenged us to think more simply about these parables. And my time doing Bible studies with some of my Korean friends has brought that out as well. But another thing that really caused me to try to dig in and appreciate this better is because whenever we were in Cambodia, whenever we were in Korea, there were times that we were discouraged. At least I was. I think Jonathan, Brandy, and Marissa felt the same way. We were discouraged that there wasn't more fruit, or in some cases any. And some of the people that we spent a lot of time and effort going to and teaching and all this effort and time, there just seemed to be no fruit. And sometimes there would seem like there was, but then it turns out, no, there was nothing there. And so in sharing some of that frustration and everything with people here and with others, one of the consolations that people would offer, and I appreciated the spirit of it, I definitely did, and the truth of it definitely is clear, but people would say, well, Bradley, you planted and you watered, but it's up to God to give the increase. And I did appreciate that, consolation that, it's not up to me to make the results happen. That depends on them and, on God. But I still see the faces of people that we preached to, studied with, spent hours, weeks, months, years maybe with. I still see their faces when I think about people who I, wish had accepted what we were teaching. And the fact that there's no increase there and that it's not my fault, doesn't change the fact that I long for these souls to be a part of the kingdom. And so I'm not saying that it's an empty consolation to say that, well, at least you planted and at least you watered. But, taking some of these principles of farming and gardening, if we're looking at it as a farmer, as a gardener, the gardener is saying, okay, there are certain things at play here. There are certain principles and laws of water and seed planting and germination and all fertilization, all of this stuff. They're thinking in those terms, but then they think, okay, what is my role in this? What can I do to either increase a harvest or to help ensure the positive outcome for what they plant? And so while the consolation is true, and the principle is true that we can only plant and water, or that those are our jobs and that God gives the increase, it still caused me to really reflect on what is it we can do, and is there anything we can do to affect the outcome of what we're sowing and what we're watering. And I don't know about you, but for me personally, I think many of the people who will be tuning into this will have heard studies and great Bible teaching on this parable of the sower, and I'm sure we've all learned some, come to understand some very, very important truths, and it's been done eloquently and all of that. But one thing that seems to stick in my mind when I've heard these lessons and when I've studied it myself in the past, we tend to go to the soils and we say, okay, which one are you? And we say, you should be the good soil. And I don't know how much farther we go with it. We should be the good soil. And if we're not, we should be. And it perhaps, teachers have gone into how to do that. But it seems to me that if you're not, if the soils are there and they are static, or we're stuck, if you're the stony soil, if you're the wayside soil, if you're the thorny soil, tough. But those of you who are the good soil, that kind of thing. So what is it we can do to change that? And so in our discussion of, what the different soils mean, I would like to encourage listeners and anyone who's looking at this parable to consider how we would, if we were a gardener or a farmer, how we would change the condition of the soil that we're working in, and think about how that applies to us in this. So I know that was kind of a long little intro there, but I'm ready to talk about the soils if you want.
No, that's good. And I think there is a danger to, sometimes we might say, oh, this person is rocky soil, or this person is someone who's just going to get choked out by the weeds, or whatever we might ascribe to a person. And that can affect the effort we put into trying to cultivate the Word of God in their life. And that's a real danger. Sometimes it's going to take more effort than others. And sometimes it's going to take harder work on our part to change the soil into what it ought to be. And our response to coming to someone with rocky soil is not to throw our hands up and say, oh, they're just rocky soil, I'll just move on and find good soil. Or even try to decide ahead of time what soil they are is dangerous. Because we never know. We might look at someone who, is a stereotypical biker. Maybe he's got the leather on and the beard and all these things. I'm sorry if I'm describing you. But we might look at someone like that and say, there's no way that this person would even care what I have to say about the kingdom of God. There's no way they're going to listen to me. And we just write them off without even giving them a chance. And we can't see the condition of the heart. Only God can see the heart, not us. When, a lot of the bikers that I've met, even though they might look like they have a rough exterior, in my history of talking to them and meeting them, they've all been super nice. And so we can't judge a book by its cover. We can't ascribe a prejudice or a certain way of thinking about this type of person to our ministry. That's to the detriment of our ministry. If all we're doing is picking and choosing which soil we want to plant on, or what we perceive to be the good soil, then we are really missing out on cultivating a full crop.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. That word cultivation that you talked about, that's a key aspect of what my focus is on this lesson, how we cultivate good soil. And, it's easy to look at, the example you gave of the rough and tough exterior biker or whatever. Some of those very people are very, just sometimes furiously, devoted, or, sorry, the word's escaping me right now, but loyal. Their loyalty is a big thing. And family, some of those, anyone that travels in packs, family and loyalty are key elements. And just like when you're examining a soil, you look at, if you were to send in a soil sample, have it tested, you might say, wow, this soil is great in these elements, but it's missing these. So we need to clear something out, add some things in. And if we can identify the people whose hearts do have elements of, loyalty, family, those things, and then capitalize on that and add in the elements that are missing, then we're, I think, on our way to cultivating good soil in their heart. So, so the different soils that are talked about here, there's four main ones. There is the wayside soil, there's the stony ground, there's the thorny soil, and then the good soil. And the explanation that the Lord gives, I really don't think needs much in the way of my explanation, except to just simply maybe reiterate that the wayside soil, I think of that as, it could even be my driveway. My asphalt driveway, there are weeds that, there's a crack, and so you can see where weeds and stuff are growing up through. But I would not choose that as the plot of ground to, plant anything. If I were to do that, it would take a lot of work to get down to where there actually is potential for growth. As far as the practical application that Jesus gives to what the wayside soil is, in our hearts and our spirits, he says, let's see, in verse 19, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, he said, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who received seed by the wayside. Now, when it says he didn't understand it, I don't know, perhaps the other accounts or extra scholarship would be able to reveal some sort of attitude here. But sometimes, there are people who do not understand because they don't want to listen, la, 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 attitude. Or there are also those who just are not able to understand it. The soil in their heart might be wayside soil, but it's not because of a belligerent, rebellious spirit. They're not to the point where they can appreciate that perspective or the truth of Scripture perhaps yet. But it could be that after some time and some, growing on their part, that condition has changed. Maybe they are more ready to listen and learn later on. And they are at a point, maybe even intellectually, where they can appreciate, or understand the truth more easily. So whether it's someone who doesn't want to understand, the la la la, can't hear you, or the person who's just not ready for it, those I think are both. I think what Jesus is referring to are both situations. And for you and I, or at least for me, when I look at someone, their attitude and their reason for not understanding is going to affect my, not my attitude, perhaps, but my approach. If someone just doesn't want to hear me, then I'm going to give them their space. But if someone just isn't quite there yet, then I want to maintain a relationship with that person, and I want to try to keep open lines of communication open, and maybe find something that they can understand or that we can agree on, to give us a step toward working them maybe to where they can understand and be less wayside. I think the element here, though, that we have to make sure we identify or recognize is it says the devil is the one who comes and snatches the truth out of their heart. And that's a frightening thing to think that we're up against, Satan, who has so many thousands of years of experience with robbing people of the basic knowledge of Scripture. But just because he's, I would say that to take perhaps the metaphor or the analogy a little farther, I would like to think that if we keep broadcasting and keep sowing the seed, the devil can't snatch up every seed. He can't get to everyone. He's limited. The word is not limited, but God's power is not limited. But Satan can only snatch the seeds that we allow to stay. So if we keep sowing and keep softening the hearts of people, then I think we can. One of them is going to plant eventually.
Satan has many years of pulling people away, but God has many years of pulling people closer as well. And he has made a plan, with all these years of experience, and obviously God knows the best way to try to save that which is lost, and he's trying to make it as simple as he can for us. He even wrote a book for us to just, read and know. We don't have to decipher anything. We just have to read the book. And God is giving us all the tools that we need to really work on the hearts of people and turn them into that good ground. So I really like that analogy, because I hadn't heard of it that way, of changing the wayside soil or changing the rocky soil or anything like that. It's always been, some people are this way and some people are that way, and that's just the way it is. But that's it's taking all responsibility off of us, and just saying, oh yeah, we just scatter the seed and that's it. What happens happens. But I think I like your approach, because there is a sense of responsibility for us to do more than just scatter the seed, but actually to work work with people individually, and not looking at everyone in a specific category.
Yeah, I agree. You talked about this earlier, about how we can make the mistake of using this parable as how we can just write people off. Well, they're not willing. They're the stony ground. They're the wayside. And we say, okay, my hands are clean. But if a farmer, if a gardener took that same approach, well, seed didn't take there, so I'll just move on. There's going to come a time when you run out of ground. So you've got to revisit and come back to it.
Yeah.
And, when I was a school teacher, I prided myself sometimes on coming up with some, creative, fun analogies to make clear the things to my middle schoolers that I was trying to teach them. And the difficulty, especially when you have smart kids in the class, is whenever you give them an analogy, they will start to take that and go farther with it. And, invariably, every one of my analogies would always run out. Like there would be an end of the line where, oh, okay, don't keep going with this because it doesn't work anymore. My way of explaining something, okay, it was cute or fun or maybe helpful on one level, but after that, it just kind of drops off. But whenever we look at the parables, one of the things that is different about that is we're talking about an example that's been crafted by the creator of the universe and the one who put these laws in place. And so we can go deep, just so deep into what this means and see how far it goes. And we find that it just continues to, bring up new levels of understanding and truth. And so when I'm talking about a gardener or a farmer, it's not because I've come up with this new way of addressing it. It's just because that is part of this. The sower went out to sow, and we're talking about the principle. Granted, the sower is God, and sometimes people apply this to us as the sowers and sowing the seed, but the parable tells us that God is the one, or the Lord is the one sowing the seed. The seed is the word of God, so He is the ultimate sower. We can sow the seed as well. We're called to do that, but He is the ultimate sower of the seed. And so, anyway, it's kind of thrilling to me to try to dig deeper and see, more ways that this applies and instructs us. But the other thing that you brought up too about, our own personal responsibility in this, that was a big question for me, or I think is a big question that we have to ask about this is, is it possible for me to change people's hearts? Because that's what we're talking about. If the soils are the hearts of men, and here I am suggesting that we can change that. Is that even possible? Well, I have just some verses I wanted to share that will hopefully help give some, some foundation for this conversation. We understand that we are ultimately responsible for the condition of our heart. The parable, I think rightly so, the parable, Jesus is not teaching, okay, all of you, get your rakes, get your shovels, get your hoe, and you go bust up people's hearts. The parable is not about those actions later on. Ultimately, we are the ones who determine the condition of our heart. Ezekiel 18:20 tells us that the fathers and sons do not bear one another's guilt, but rather, and the righteous and the wicked do not share each other's guilt or justification. Each person stands or falls based on their own righteousness or sin. And then 1 Peter 1:17 explains that the Father judges without partiality, each one according to their own works. You and I are not judged based on what the other one does. And the Father and the sons are not judged based on what each other does, but it's our own works that will condemn or justify us. And it's not only that, but the Lord does not judge with partiality based on who we are, but our own responsibility in proving ourselves is key. So that principle is there. And if we stopped there, we might say, okay, well, see, I told you, if someone's a stony heart or a wayside heart, then that's on them. And that's partially true, I believe, because we've just read about it. But at the same time, Scripture also draws out how our actions can impact the mindset, the attitude, the hearts of others. In Proverbs 15:1, a verse that many of your listeners will have heard, it says that a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So we have here two examples of actions on my part that can impact the attitude and the emotions and the of others. My soft answer can turn away wrath. Where does wrath happen? Where does that take place? Well, that's on the inside. That's in the heart. And so my actions can impact the heart of someone else in a positive way. But at the same time, it says that a harsh word stirs up anger. And so in a negative way, if I am being harsh and unloving to others, then I can actually, perhaps, maybe you could say, almost like the sun baking the ground where it gets that hard crust that you have to dig through. If I'm harsh to someone, I can cause an angry spirit in them, and an angry person is not going to be willing to listen. That seed is just going to bounce right off and be a snack for the birds. 1 Peter chapter 2 also explains how our actions not only can stir up anger or put away wrath, but it says we can actually, through our own obedience and righteous actions, cause others not just to feel an emotion, but even to glorify God. So we, through our obedience, through our love and our actions, we can cause others to be directed to God, to direct their own reverence to God. It says we can cause others to glorify God. Matthew chapter 18, verse 6, Jesus uses a phrase that is a little frightening, but he warns whenever he's talking about children there and the importance of children. And I believe this is also where he says, of such is the kingdom of God. But he says, whoever causes one of these little ones to sin, he's introducing, or he's explaining, demonstrating, I should say, that someone like me can behave in such a way to, it says, cause one of these little ones to sin. Now, I don't know the exact relationship of the cause and effect or the degree to which I am responsible for one of these little ones to sin, but we know how, we've seen how impressionable and malleable the character and the attitude of little ones is. And, a little one who might have no predisposition to any kind of attitude might portray something simply because mom or dad has it, or someone they look up to has that attitude. And so they will try to mirror something that they've seen in others, even if they're acting like a little jerk. Like, where did they learn that? And then you interact perhaps with a rude mother or father and you go, oh, okay. Well, would any of us say that child was born a little jerk, or were they just rude from the womb? I don't think any of us would say that. And Jesus didn't say that. He said, of such is the kingdom of heaven. And we need to be like this if we want to have any hope of being brought into the kingdom of heaven. Would he tell us to be like someone who was born rude? No. So the reasoning doesn't hold up to say that someone is born that way. So recognizing how impressionable and malleable those young ones are, it's clear to see how our actions can cause them to sin. And the one more verse I wanted to share, just to kind of bring this point home, comes from 1 Peter 3,
Okay.
verses 1 and 2, where it is teaching wives how through their conduct, their chaste conduct and obedience and honoring of their husband, through these things, it says that without a word, they might win their husband over to the truth. And that is talking about a complete change in someone. That's to me, if we try to apply it to this passage that we're reading, is talking about someone who was stony, someone who was wayside soil, and now they're good soil. And what was the thing that happened between, besides their own personal responsibility and their own willingness to be changed and cultivated, besides that, what was the thing that made the difference? Was even it says, silent actions of a godly wife. That's a very, very, very powerful demonstration of how our actions can impact the soil of someone else's heart. So somewhere we have in the middle a compromise between my own responsibility to tend to and care for and cultivate my own heart, but at the same time, we need to be mindful of the effect our actions have on the soil, the condition of the soil, and the openness of other people's hearts. So we've talked about the wayside soil a little bit. And then the stony soil, I think for a long time, I just heard that as another one that is to be written off because they're not accepting. But when we read carefully and listen to what it says, Jesus explains that's not the case. He says in verse 20, it says, but he who received the seed on stony places, where they're not wayside soil, but where there are rocks, perhaps a dense concentration of rocks that make the access to the soil very limited. It says, this is he who hears the word. So they hear it. And it says they immediately receive it with joy. It's easy to look at the stony ground and just kind of dismiss it. But look at this. If we look at this initial reaction, there is some tremendous potential being demonstrated here. Someone who understands it and receives it, not only receives it, but with a joyful spirit. Now, I think perhaps you've seen someone who seems just so eager and so ready and willing to be rescued from a life of sin. They come into the church and they perhaps visit and they see the sense of family. If they're in a place where there is, a tremendous feeling of love and openness, oh man, that can warm their heart and they can open their eyes to something they've, expose them to something they've never been a part of. Some people's family lives and everything are just very tragic and cold and lonely. And so when they see that, of course, there's a hopefulness and a joy about that. But it says, verse 21, yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecutions arise because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Someone who is, I don't want to say they're in it for the wrong reasons, but someone who doesn't have a deep-rooted faith, whenever, like it says, when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, what does that look like? What does it mean for those things to arise because of the word? If we look at that same example of someone coming in to, the Lord's church and seeing, the loving atmosphere and spirit, and then they go home and back into that old environment, and the people in that environment are challenging the church, challenging their faith, challenging them on all these things they don't yet understand, well, then they can start to feel perhaps like what they believed in or what they hoped for either isn't real, or they aren't worthy of it, or they don't understand it. And so doubt is planted and they're pulled away, but they don't have the faith and the steadfastness yet to be able to stand up to those things. And that's because they don't have the roots. They don't, in this, soil, there's no depth of understanding that allows them to have, the strong footing to hold themselves in place. So in those situations, I think it's vital that we recognize when someone is at that point and we try to identify what they need. and draw out what it is they need to know and understand so they can grow and can establish those roots in their heart. So when people challenge them, they can say, you know what? I don't have all the answers, but I do have my own basic faith that I'm going to hold to, and help them know that they have a network of God's people who they can ask to help receive strength, help, offer, prayer for them, be there as the support and the love that they need, so that whenever they're seeking answers, we can help them to find them, and even demonstrate to them, you know what? I don't know either, but I know enough to give me the faith to carry me through the times when I can't find the answers myself. Perhaps you have known people when you ask them a question, they assume you have a questioning spirit, you're challenging them. They take all questions as a challenge of their authority or a challenge of the truth. But Jesus saw questions as an opportunity to demonstrate his authority and to reveal the hearts of those who are asking. And so I think questions are a beautiful, beautiful thing. Even if we sometimes wonder or maybe question the attitude of the person who's asking them, if we have confidence in the word and in God, I think there's no question that's off limits or not safe. And so we need to be willing to learn it, have the understanding. We need to have those roots and to be not discouraged by those kinds of questions.
Whenever someone first becomes a Christian, a lot of times they are more like this stony soil in many cases. This might be one of the most common soils that we come across, where on the top it looks, fine. In fact, here it says that some fell on stony places where they didn't have much earth. What I picture there is that maybe that the rocks are maybe underneath the surface, just barely not visible, or maybe some places it's poking up. But there's a thin layer of dirt, which is good. You need that. But if the sun comes out and the roots don't go very deep because of the rocks, then those plants are going to be scorched because they don't have the depth of root to get the nutrition and water that they need to survive. They just get burned up. Again, I think this is probably, especially with people who are new converts, this is probably the most common soil we'll come across, is someone who they receive the word, they're excited, and they want to do what's right, but they don't yet possess the really strong convictions that maybe we have, that our convictions have been developed and grown over time, and they've become stronger through times when we've had to stand up for the truth, whenever it's challenged or whenever someone tries to pull us away or we get discouraged. We get through that, and that creates that depth of soil. But the people who are new converts, who are just new to receiving the good news of the kingdom, those people are often very shallow, and they're going to have to work on getting through tough times and trials and tribulations and hardships. Maybe their family or friends are going to ridicule them for being Christians. And that's really, really tough. It's hard. And so whenever that happens to people, sometimes it can destroy their faith because they just don't want to deal with that ridicule or that hardship or that trial, and they just burn up. Whenever those hard times come, they just give in. I think of like 1 Corinthians 8 when it talks about the weaker brother, the person who has a conviction or a conscience, but he lacks the strength and the fortitude to stand up for that conscience. And so whenever he sees his brother go into the idol's temple, he is emboldened to go too. He doesn't quite possess the strength to withstand that temptation or that trial.
Yeah.
And so he goes, and it says that he sins because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, I would say a lot of times this is probably the most common soil that we come across, and we have to really, like you said, cultivate a deepness and a richness and a resolve for the word in their life.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right, brother. I think it is a very common one. And I think you're right that it does manifest itself a lot in young converts, people that are very new to the faith. But I think you and I have also, many have probably also seen this same condition demonstrated by people who have been in the church for years. And what would that look like? Mm-hmm. What would it look like for someone to have been in the church for years and know all the people, know all the, go to all the meetings, know all the right things to say, be comfortable with around the church? How could that person still have a heart that is stony soil? What does that look like? Well,
I have a verse for that.
Oh, okay.
I'll just read the verse because I think it speaks directly to this. Ephesians 4, verses 17 through 21 says, "So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have been given over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus." So the telling thing here is in Ephesians chapter 4, he's speaking to Christians about the hardness of their heart. And I think this is telling to us because it shows us that we can become these types of soil. I just gave a sermon this past Sunday. I don't know if you've listened to it. It's on the podcast YouTube channel about the gospel. But one of the things I brought up, which I got from a book, is that we need to focus on not making people make a decision. In other words, I can convince someone to be baptized. And that's just convincing someone to make a decision, but that's not making a disciple. Mm. And it's important to make a disciple and that be the reason why they want to be a believer or a Christian. Mm-hmm. Just convincing someone to be baptized, that's one thing. But making a disciple, that's a completely different thing. That's all about cultivating the soil and helping them become what they need to be. Yeah. I think that is important.
I think a really good example of that is some of what I've seen in some foreign work with another preacher is that he was vastly, he had the people on the other side outgunned, intellectually with his experience and his Bible knowledge. He was the guy bringing the cannon to a water pistol fight. He knew. So convincing them and defeating their arguments was no sweat. But convicting their heart, that's a very different thing.
Yeah.
And you can convince someone, you can get to the point that they have no more argument to come at you with, but that doesn't mean you've changed their heart. And so what is the ingredient that's missing there? Well, perhaps, who knows? Maybe the soil's not right in their heart. Maybe you've come at them with the wrong attitude. It could be that they are wayside at that point and not able to understand, not willing, not ready. Maybe there are too many stones in their heart. But anyway, I don't want to misapply the principle there. But you're right. Convincing the mind and convicting the heart, they're both essential, but they're not the same thing. And I think, which one is more important? Well, we have to look at every situation differently. Maybe someone is ready. Maybe their heart is ready and they're willing to learn and grow. We would say that's soil with potential, regardless of exactly how many rocks are in it or what thorns might be in their life. There's some potential in that soil, and so we want to convince their mind by giving them the seed that they need to, giving it some space to grow. But if they're not even willing to listen, then that soil is clearly not ready. And so, if we had the attitude of just, oh, well, just keep sowing, just keep sowing, just keep sowing. If I was out there in my driveway throwing seed on the driveway, you wouldn't go, oh, good for him. He's doing what he needs to do. Just keep sowing, fella. You wouldn't drive down the road. Good work. You'd go, what is this guy thinking? Now, that might be an oversimplification of it. We can't, I can look out there and see, it's just bouncing off the ground. We can't have that same awareness, that same clarity with people's hearts. But if we're discerning and careful and really listening to them and watching their reactions to us, we can, I think, see whether things are connecting. And, I've had people before where I thought we were making good headway, and I never hear from them. I reach out to them and, try, and I get nothing. And I'm like, I thought this was a good situation. I thought this was good soil. We were having good conversations, but if they're not even willing to get back with me, who knows? Maybe they've gotten choked out. Maybe they're just not ready. Again, we can't know. But so I'm saying that because there are certain situations where we need to continue sowing, and maybe the sowing process itself will help to reveal the condition of the soil. We can't, like you said, we can't judge a book by its cover and go, oh, looky there, that guy, he's good soil. Me first. We can't see that and can't know the error of the seed casting beforehand sometimes. But anyway, so I've mentioned the choking a little bit already. That is the next soil, is the thorny soil. And so Jesus explains in verse 22 of Matthew 13, now he who received a seed among the thorns, this is he who hears the word. So there is some reception. He hears it. He hears the word, and the deceit, the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word. That's such a sad picture to me, because it sounds to me like what he's saying is that this heart, it's already, it's got the potential. It hears it, and it seems like it is now, there are some roots and something is starting to grow. There's some type of faith. And when I think about what this person looks like, to me, this looks like someone who might already, if it's a man, starting to take teaching or leadership roles, being active in the church, we go, oh, look at him, he's doing great. And when someone, from elsewhere says, hey, how's brother, so-and-so doing? We say, oh, man, he's leading songs now. He's offering prayer. And we go, we get excited for that growth. And then all of a sudden, the next time they ask, we're like, man, he's gone. I don't know what happened. We wonder, because we're looking at those actions and thinking that is a sign of growth and involvement. And maybe in some way it is. But when they get pulled, perhaps their spouse did not have the faith that they have. And so even though they're trying, their concern for their spouse and their relationship draws them away. Or a job, pressure from work chokes out the faith that, man, I've got to make money for my family. I just can't keep doing this Sunday thing, or other family pressures, or I know today in a society where, people are so ready to lift up, someone who's intellectual and intelligent and astute and able to, bring words to their mind. They know all the big words and know all the isms and all that. That's lifted up. And so if you're in one of those fields and people make the association that religion is for those who don't have the mind that can understand real truth, religion is for the suckers, and religion is for the dummies and the cavemen, they're like, oh, I can't afford that association. I don't want that association. So they'll leave. So those, I think, are some of the thorns we're talking about here. The cares of this life, and the deceitfulness of riches, it says. Those pressures can choke out what was a growing faith. I don't know so far. I don't know which one is more sad so far. The person who, they wanted it, but they couldn't they weren't able to establish any depth of root. Whether that's more sad, or the one that's like, oh, look, they've got it. They're doing, and then all of a sudden, where'd they go? They're both tragic and sad, and ultimately the responsibility is on that person. But it makes me wonder, what could I have done? What could we have done to help in those situations? And that's not to say that we can't bring them back. The soil is a changing element, but so that's the basic look at what I think the thorny soil is.
Whenever I think of the thorny soil, I think of Colossians chapter 3. In Colossians chapter 3, it talks about the importance of taking off the old man and putting on the new. And to me, what this essentially describes is someone who has put on the new man, but hasn't taken off the old man. Mm-hmm. And so you have this person who has taken the word and received the word, but he hasn't removed his love for the world. So he has a love for the kingdom, but he also he also has this love for the world as well. And so he's because of that, he's not fully committed. He wants to be, but he also has a love of money, or he has a love of some other worldly attraction. And these two things are at odds in his life. And eventually the things of the world win over, and his love of money, or his love of possessions, or whatever it may be, this worldly attraction wins over his love for God. And he eventually leaves altogether. He's choked out by these things. And that's kind of the way that I viewed it. It's someone who has put on the new man and has never taken off the old man.
I think that's a good connection. It makes me think too of how, the Bible describes sin. Sin is brought about when we are drawn away by our own lusts. The things that we're not willing to let go of, they still pull us away. They're moving away from God. And so they are, perpetually moving away from God toward darkness. And if we are drawn away by that, or continue to have a hold on it, it will pull us away from God. And so, I think you're right that the thorns have the choking potential of the thorns is increased when we're hanging on to them, or when we are keeping the thorns in our life. Coming back to the personal responsibility, and I'm glad you brought that up. I had not really made that connection before. That's a very helpful insight for that particular kind of soul, and the power we individually have to bring ourselves up and out of it. We're not going to be able to until we're willing to let go of those things that are drawing us away. And, I started to say this earlier, we got off on something else, but I asked the question, back about the stony soil and what that looks like. There's a shallowness, a simple shallowness to their faith. And I said, so what does can that still exist in people who have been in the church a long time? And one of the things that I've noticed, that I see people who, I've seen this with parents who, folks I know who have children in the church that are old enough to have made decisions not to follow anymore, or to feel like they have found a higher way than the rest of us. It's different situations. But I remember once this one set of parents, their children, their son-in-law had gone off to be a part of another group. Some would say that this fellow is living his best life now because he's successful and different things, but, being pulled away. And he had some attitudes and some mindsets, and talking with the brother later, found out he had some attitudes and some mindsets that were very dangerous. But in talking to the parents, prior, one of the things they emphasized, well, he's, I'm trying to be sensitive and careful, but he has done this. There was an outward thing that he had done, which some would say there's no problem with, but to them it was a big deal. And to me, that demonstrated not a vainness necessarily, or a misdirected concern, but a shallowness of their own understanding. Now, this outward physical decision that had been made, that really doesn't matter when you're considering what's really important. Like, there's a deeper issue that needs to be approached, but they saw a symptom,
right,
and they were concerned more about the symptom than the disease. If I've got, I think maybe a connection would be, if I've got cancer and if it's in my whole system, my whole body, I'm not so concerned about the mole. I'm concerned about getting it out of my system. Cleansing the disease before just scraping off the mole. Removing the outward sign doesn't get rid of the inward, deeper disease. What it seems to me is that there are people who can still have a shallow faith. They might be around, and maybe they're doing the best they know how to do, but when it comes to others, they see these outward symptoms, and they can only understand kind of a shallow, on a shallow level, rather than a depth of forgiveness and understanding and seeking after what a real solution to the problem. So that's my suggestion about perhaps what the stony soil could look like in those who have been in the church for a long time. And we were saying this earlier, just because you're a member of the Lord's church, a member of the kingdom, doesn't mean that you are 100% good and fertile soil. I don't think.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair thing to say. I think these warnings are not just to people who are on the outside, but people who are on the inside. Okay, so one more element of this thorny soil, back to the thorny soil before we move on to the good soil, which is the one we love talking about because we all think we're the good soil. When is he going to talk about me? But with the thorny soil, one element that I think is easy to read over, it has been for me, is one thing that Jesus says about it, back, not in his explanation, but back when he's talking about the actual introducing the parable to them. He says, some sprang up among thorns in verse 7, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. Let's see. I'm looking for let's see. Okay, I missed it. Where am I? I'm looking for I thought it was about the thorns that it said they bore no fruit. Am I seeing the wrong place here?
Verse 22.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful.
Right there. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Thanks for hunting it down. I was expecting it on one line, and I didn't keep looking. Oh, so becoming unfruitful. I think it's important that we, ask what it means to be fruitful. Because a moment ago, I suggested that someone in the church could be the thorny soil because, it looks like they're doing all the right things. Like, oh, this guy's leading songs, or, he and his wife are helping coordinate a Bible study, and they're helping people, outside the church and serving, and they're involved. And you think, oh, great, that means they're the good soil. Well, but when they fall away, or even if they are just there and not truly growing, and are not helping if they're not going on and sowing the seed themselves, just because they're there doesn't mean that they are good soil. If someone is just kind of filling a pew, we might say, or there's no fruit actually coming from it, we can think they're good soil, but in fact they might be the thorny soil because there's no fruit coming from it. So the reason I say that is because just because we can't see the choking, we can't see them being pulled away. If there's no fruit, the good soil, something we'll find out about the good soil in a moment, is there's no good soil that has 0-fold. It's some 100, some 60, some 30. So good soil that produces no fruit is in fact not good soil. I would suggest that it's perhaps thorny soil that is just stuck and the thorns are preventing it. Maybe they haven't fallen away outwardly. Maybe they're still present, but there's no fruit coming from it. There's no real growth and no fruit coming from it. So what does this look like? I don't know. I mentioned someone just filling the pew. Maybe there's someone who's been there for years and years. They're always there on Sunday, but that's it. We never see them sharing with others. Or I shouldn't say we don't see them. Maybe they are not sharing with others. It's not our job to police each other, obviously, but we want to encourage each other to, do the work we're supposed to do. But if someone is just there and they think they've checked their box and they're good, I would suggest that's not good soil. We need to be able to recognize that and encourage them to be the good soil. No fruit means not good soil. So thank you for helping me find verse 22.
That could be that could be the shallow soil rather than the thorny soil. The shallow soil might think that my only responsibility is to myself and just to show up on Sunday and fill this pew. That would be a very shallow understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And so that seems to me like a very shallow type of soil. Do you want to move on to this good soil here in verse 23?
Sure. Absolutely. Sorry, we've already hinted at one of the main points of it. And, like we said, sometimes when we hear the parable of the sower, a preacher stands up. Today we're speaking on the parable of the sower. We go, oh, good. We're going to talk about me at the end because I'm the good soil. I'm here. Well, that's not what I think this is about. We're trying to understand not just who we are, but be able to examine our own hearts more carefully and then reach out and see how we can impact others. So verse 23 says, but he who received seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it. So there's hearing and understanding. And understanding, is not just a passive thing where, if I'm smart enough, I'll get it. I had a friend in middle school and high school who understood math. He was just a whiz, and I was not. And so I would ask for help on homework and things. And when I'd say, okay, so help me with this one. And he would just give me the answer. I'm going, no, but how did you get there? And he would go, oh, that's just the answer. Yeah. So a page worth of work, it would take me a page worth of work to figure it out. He just knew it. Well, that wasn't very helpful, to me. So the understanding is not just a passive thing. We have to work toward, it takes effort and work to understand something. So he who hears the word and understands, who also puts the effort into and has the openness of spirit to understand it. This is, understands, who indeed, it says, bears fruit and produces. So one of the telling indicators of good soil is that there will be fruit. Perhaps that fruit is in our own personal growth. Perhaps it's in helping to bring others to the gospel. But, a mature plant, a little sapling of a plant, like a pine tree, when it grows up, you don't see any pine cones on it. You don't see it producing seed. It has to get to a point where it can produce that seed and then, get it out there and sow it in its own way. And so if we truly understand the word and are able to share, I think the sharing is one of those signs, that producing of seed on our own and sharing and sowing the seed on our own is one of those indicators that we are producing fruit ourselves. And in the beginning, it's going to be probably very simple, and probably a very simple yield, if any, from what we put out there. But it says there will be some that will be 100-fold, some 60, some 30. It does not say that some good soil will produce no fruit. And so that's why I propose that the thorny soil, is where things grow and can stay, can subsist. That's why I see it a little different. You mentioned that shallow understanding could be the stony. And I think perhaps you're right there, but I think of it as the thorny soil because it's still growing, it's still alive, it hasn't withered away like in the stony soil. Mm-hmm. There's some depth, but there's no fruit. And so, it's worth challenging that thought by saying, is it real if they're not fruit? But so
it's both,
right? So, there is this vital question that we have to ask: which one am I? That is absolutely a vital question that we need to ask. But I think the challenge in answering that is that sometimes we don't know, or we think we know, or we assume which one we are. And if we are not the good soil, it's going to be possibly very convicting and very challenging and maybe very discouraging to recognize that we're not the good soil. Oh, man, if I'm not, what am I doing that has produced fruit? If we're honest with ourselves about that, I think it's a very sobering thing to really make sure we're putting ourselves in the correct category. We've already talked about not misidentifying others, but we have to be careful not to misidentify ourselves. I'm here, good soil right here, We have to be careful not to, there's danger on either side. There's the danger of saying, that guy's wayside, not going to waste my time. There's also the danger for ourselves and for others of saying, oh, they're good. We don't have to worry about them. They're already the good soil. Because a good, fertile, ready, prepared plot of ground that you're not putting seed into and that you're not cultivating is in some ways just as useless as the stony ground. It doesn't fully get to be recognize its full value. The farmer, the Lord, the sower, doesn't get to enjoy the harvest until we actually plant something in that cultivated soil. And so there's never a point where we go, sweet, I'm the good soil, I'm done. Now what are you doing? So for those of us who are the good soil, it's not just time to celebrate, that you've got the right heart. Good soil requires continued cultivation, because what happens? Someone can throw rocks into your garden. Someone can sow tares into your garden. The very following parable that the Lord follows this one with is exactly that. The enemy coming and sowing tares in their garden. In with the wheat and the tares, and says that they're going to live together. And at the end, whenever the Lord sends his angels to take us away, the tares and the wheat will all be taken up together. But there can still be things that are thrown into our garden that try to choke us out, but we have to be good. We have to tend the garden of our own heart as well as the garden of other people's hearts. So that's our kind of basic overview of the principles that are taught here. But one of the things that I tried to focus on is what are some of the things that we need in order to cultivate good soil with real potential. And these are some of those things I sent you, before. But there are a few things that I think we can do, things we need to have in our life if we are going to have the kind of soil that, can be fertile, can be good soil with lots of potential for growth. The first one is that we need to I've got, I guess, 4 that I'll share, but the first one is that we need to have a discerning heart. I'll read a couple of passages here. Let's see. Ecclesiastes 8:5 says that a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. James 3:17-18 says it refers to wisdom that comes from above and makes the distinction about wisdom that comes from God as first pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, all of these things. 1 Kings 3 is a record of when Solomon, requests from God a discerning heart to rule his people faithfully. But even that man with the discerning heart later turned his heart away from God. Chapter 11 talks about how he turned away from God. He allowed himself to be pulled away. Some would say, oh man, Solomon, that's the guy to follow. Well, when he was following God, yes. But when he turned away from God, it seems that he lost his discernment. And so what connection does this have to our hearts and the soil? Well, we are told that we need to rightly divide not only the word of God, but we need to be able to have a discerning spirit that recognizes truth and error. If I'm planting a garden and I have a handful of seeds, but I don't know what they are, that fertile soil could be in peril. If I'm about to throw bad seed out there, if I'm about to throw weed seed out there or poison or something, then all the work that was done to prepare that soil could be for naught if I'm not discerning about what it is I'm sowing. And so we need to understand what it is that is being sown in our hearts. We need to have teachers and our own minds that are aware of the truth and able to understand it, and make sure that what we're ingesting and what we're digesting is truth and clear, pure doctrine, not lies, not things that have been twisted. The analogy that I've heard before about what they say about rat poison or mouse poison, the things that they use to kill those animals. I know we're getting away from the gardening metaphor, but they say that a lot of those things are 99.999 or whatever % food. It's that 0.0001% of poison that is put in that is lethal. And so just because something looks good or a seed looks similar to another one doesn't mean that we should just trust it. We need to be very shrewd and very discerning about the things that are taught among God's people and the things that we teach, because if the seed is the word of God, we need to make sure that we're planting a good, pure, true seed in others, and that we are only accepting truth into our own soil, into our own heart. So we have to have discerning hearts to only plant and accept the truth. So not only do we need to have a heart that is wise and discerning, and maybe that shouldn't be the first one, that we start with, to say, have a wise, discerning heart. Maybe that doesn't seem like the best basic thing to seek for, but it does, I think, give us something for which to shoot, for which to aspire. So then the other, one more thing that we need to have is, I think, a peaceful heart. And Scripture tells us about how the Word gives us peace, and God gives us peace for His people. And we can have confidence. When we understand the Word, we can have confidence in our convictions, in our faith. And I think this connects or correlates to our concept of a garden, because whenever we have prepped the soil and it's time to sow the seed, the next day, once it's been sown, we don't go out there with a rake and till it up again. We don't go, rake up the soil. Okay, let me keep cultivating this good soil. And then the next day, because every time the roots begin to establish, we just shake it up. Well, you're killing what was there. You're uprooting, the things that are trying to grow when they're at their most fragile. And so, I don't know exactly what that would look like in a congregation or in an environment, but I think about whenever, Paul, I think is in, I was going to say Rome. I can't remember where he has this interaction, but he's around the folks who, it says they always wanted to learn something new continually. They were never able to just relax in what they understood and really find peace in their convictions. They were always looking for something new. And I think we probably have all met someone like that. I know in my time abroad, you see people who are out finding themselves. That's what they say. And I don't know what they're finding all the time, but I'm not sure that what they're finding is themselves. They're just looking for something new, it seems, or maybe answers to questions, and they think if they get enough miles under their belt, or they collect enough stickers on their cup, or they get enough stamps on their passport, they will know themselves better. And while those experiences can give us opportunity to be tested and learn more about ourselves, seeking truth in all those other places can, I think, have a very unsettling effect on us. And even in the Lord's church, if we are not, if we're surrounded by people who cause doubt in our mind or have a questioning attitude towards the hearts of others, judge the spirits of others and question their attitudes, it gives us a sense that we are not safe, or that we are, perhaps, I don't know, I don't want to say threatened, but that there's something wrong with our convictions. And that unsettling sort of unearths and weakens the hold we have, the roots we started to lay down. And so even good soil needs a peaceful environment, one with, I think, limited conflict, one where we're not looking for challenges and battles, but trying to first establish our own faith before we reach out and try to do things elsewhere. So Colossians 3:15 says, "And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which you were also called in one body, and be thankful." So there's a sense in which we have to have a sense of peace in our convictions. And I think one way to do that is continuing to study and learn so we can have a confidence in what we believe. That's one, I think, tangible thing we can do to establish our own faith and have a peaceful attitude. 1 Timothy 6:6 talks about how it says that godliness with contentment is great gain. Whenever we aspire for more, there's a lot of activity and effort. But whenever we find some contentment with what we have and what we understand, and just do the best that we can, I think that helps us to have that peaceful attitude. Two more. One is that we need to have a loving heart, and one that loves the truth. A heart that is ready to receive the seed, and a heart that is filled with love. That I think the best thing I can do is just point us to what the Bible says about love itself. Colossians 3:14, just before the passage we just read about the peace of God ruling in our hearts, it tells us, above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. I don't know how exactly to connect this back to our, parable that we've been studying, but love is a vital element in what every heart needs and every person needs in order to be able to grow in their knowledge, in their relationships, and as a member of the body of Christ. As a member of the body, we have to have love that binds us and brings us together if we're ever to grow in our faith as well. So a loving heart is one, I think, that will be able to grow. Maybe you could say that's the lifeblood, or that's the water that nourishes the seed in order to be able to grow. And then finally, this one comes back a little bit to what we talked about in the beginning about a discerning heart, but we also need to make sure that we guard our hearts and guard the hearts of others, because what are you worried about once you've made a garden or a farm, and once you've got things in place and the seed is doing well, what are you watching for now? You're watching for insects and pests. You're watching for other things to come eat what you've planted. You're worried about diseases coming in. Just because the seed took root and is growing doesn't mean that your job is done. We need to guard and protect our hearts. What does that look like? Well, we already talked earlier about not allowing bad seed, wicked seed, unpure, untruthful seed to be planted. But it also means not allowing these untruthful doctrines and teachings, not giving them a place in our own minds, being able to discern, is it truth? Is it error? If it's truth, I can take it. If it's error, it has no place in my life. But then as a leader, perhaps, or a member of a congregation, we need to be very watchful. I think about the role of elders. The Bible says that elders are going to be shepherds of the flock. A shepherd's job is to protect and care for and guard and defend the flock. And so we need to be able to defend our hearts from those who would come in and try to teach false things, or even maybe those within who are sowing seeds of doubt, or, maybe trying to upset the soil. They come in and they say, this might seem like a silly example, but they say, oh, you don't need to be a part of the Bible study that family is doing. We really are better at that. So come over and we'll work with you on that. That can start to bring in, elements of pride and distrust and, things like that can cause the soil, someone's heart, to be injured and upset. If not the person who's being pulled over, what about the ones who you've, put down? So there are lots of different ways that we have to guard and protect our hearts from, proud influences, untrue influences. And just because someone knows their Bible doesn't mean that they can't be guilty of possibly introduce. We've seen that in our, association, people who knew their stuff. Man, they knew their stuff, but I think their heart perhaps they didn't have the love of the truth they needed to have, and they were allowed to be pulled away and drawn away by something more enticing. And we've got to make sure those things we don't allow them into our own heart, and that we don't allow them to affect those who are younger. So I guess back to what we talked about earlier, there is a shared, there is consolation in knowing that God is the one that gives the increase. And we are to be sowers. We are to be sowing the seed. But God is the ultimate sower, and we have the ability as the ones dispensing the truth and sowing the seed further. And we have the ability and opportunity, and I think we're called to be discerning in where and how we sow. And as we do so, consider the soil that it's falling on, see how we can understand how to improve, not only cast the seed where it will have the best chance of growing, but how we can increase those chances and improve the potential for the truth to really take hold in the hearts of people, and not give up just because someone has accepted the truth. Their heart still needs cultivation. And those of us who think, I'm the good soil, I'm the 30, the 60, I'm the 100-fold guy, still making sure that we are guarding our hearts and cultivating the kind of soil that we need. Because to me, that the 100-fold guy can very, very easily have a gigantic weed of pride come up in his heart. So we have to, his or her heart. Mm-hmm. I've known people who their own personal ability is one of the greatest stumbling blocks, I think, in their life. They might not call it that way or see it that way, but they say, how could God not want me to use this ability in the worship of the church? I think about talented musicians who say, oh man, God has given me this ability. I'm supposed to use it for him, and you're telling me I can't use it in worship and praise to him. Well, if we're not careful, we can allow our own abilities to become kind of a weed or a thorn, one of the tares that the devil has sown in our heart to draw us away from just following the simple plan that God has given us. So I hope, well, we've gone down perhaps some rabbit holes. I've tried to stay on course and give some practical things to look at for what this could look like, what it could mean, and hopefully get people thinking in terms that they can identify ways that they can help others with having the right kind of soil in their heart.
I think there's so much more that we could say about this parable. This is one of the richest parables that Jesus told. And, we could talk about, what the good soil is. We didn't really discuss that. The good soil would basically be soil that does not include everything that the bad soils previously had. And then, what does it mean whenever it talks about some producing 100 and 60 and 30? We're not all going to produce the same as Christians, and we shouldn't have that expectation that we we can't look down on the person who's producing 30 and say, well, I produce 100. But like you said, pride
Yeah.
can really creep into someone's life in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage people listening to also look at verses 10 through
Yeah.
10 through
10 through
17 as
yeah,
well,
definitely.
which we didn't even cover, but it also helps enrich these parables even more. And so I will give you homework, those listening, to continue studying this parable and to look into it more deeply, look into the verses that we didn't cover or some aspects that we didn't address very deep, and really study it out for yourself and see what all you can gain from it. Bradley, we want to thank you for coming on and for your insights and all the wisdom that you shared with us from these parables and giving us new ways of looking at this parable that hopefully we can apply to our life.
Thank you.
Thanks again for taking time out of your day to listen to the Real Biblical Application podcast. If you have any questions about the discussion that was had today, please email me at realbiblicalapplication@gmail.com. And remember, keep on learning and finding ways to apply the Word of God to your life.